Dear colleagues, we continue with our section, and our next presenter is Elena Racheva, Oxford University. War without peace. The militarization of Russian society is one of the outcomes of war in Afghanistan and Chechnya. Elena, the floor is yours. Elena, hi colleagues. It's a great honor for me to talk to you today. I love your conference. It's a privilege to make my presentation. This is based on my PhD at Oxford University. It's work in progress still, but I wanted to share some preliminary conclusions. I focus on two military operations in Chechnya as the latest and the bloodiest conflicts in modern Russian history that have affected the country the most, according to official information. 620 soldiers, mostly conscripts, passed through Afghanistan during the decade of the war. That's a huge amount of people. They came back, they live across various cities of Russia. I met them and interviewed them. In my presentation, I wanted to talk about how the state discourse changed, how these wars that were essentially lost became similar to the veterans of the Second World War, the Great World War. And I want to talk about how the state started to use them as a political tool and a means of new military mobilization campaigns. Over the past 2 decades, Russia conducted an unprecedented campaign of military modernization. The country doubled its defense budget. It reached 4% of the country's GDP. It increased defense industry and international arms trade, conducted a large-scale reform of the army. A recent Levada Center poll indicated that 63% of the informants consider army as the most trustworthy institute, and the president of Russia received only 60% of trust. Moreover, we all know that every few years, Russia participated in various military campaigns in South Ossetia and Donbass and Syria. In addition, which is perhaps less known from the outside, Russia initiated a patriotic mobilization campaign, creating a new discourse of military glory. For many years, the Great Patriotic War was the only officially celebrated war in the history of the Soviet Union, and its veterans were the only ones recognized as veterans under the Soviet military law. No other war participants were granted the status. The next great war campaign in Afghanistan for a long time was hugely unpopular. Its participants were not granted the status of veterans. It was looked down upon in 1991. According to a poll conducted by the Levada Center, 69% of the informants called this war a crime against the state. Throughout the 90s, it was remembered as something shameful, senseless, and something that ended in defeat. Moreover, the society was frightened by the Afghan syndrome and the media coverage of the veterans struggling with post-traumatic syndrome disorders. They were potentially coming back to the society, being aggressive, and this further stigmatized and marginalized them. One of my informants, interviewees, noted that when they returned home, they found themselves in complete social isolation. When he was walking down the street with his future wife, his friends would not approach her because they thought that he was aggressive and dangerous. But in the 2000s, the attitude to the Afghan war from the state started to change. A new state discourse of the war in Afghanistan began to emerge. The state was starting to treat the Afghan war as this new big military campaign that would be a continuation of the Great Patriotic War. The first welcome speech, or greeting speech from Putin to mark the 11th anniversary of the withdrawal of the troops after a few months from him coming to power, contained all of the future themes of this future state discourse. And I will read the long quote, which I think is very important. the soldiers internationalists honestly performed their duties on the Afghan soil. They were faithful to their oaths and fierce battles. They showed merciless stamina and courage. They became famous for their fighting spirit and courage. The feat of the heroes of the Afghan war is timeless. So we will always remember the fallen sons of Russia and pay tribute to the Afghan veterans. Many of them are still in military service today in the course of the anti-terrorist operations in the North Caucasus. Their experience and training helped us overcome the most critical situations. On the one hand, this is similar to normal military discourse. On the other hand, this quote contains new themes, such as the bonds of the Afghan Brotherhood. We know that there was a lot of hazing in the Afghan army. But here he's talking about the courage of the soldiers, their loyalty to military service, and that was contrasted with the meaninglessness of the war itself. There are allusions to modern anti-terrorist campaign, compared the invasion of Afghanistan with the fight against international terrorism, political Islam. He kept talking about this war being just, being necessary. Towards the late 2010s, this attitude started to change. People started to talk about this war being just, required, that nobody ever doubted the necessity of a military intervention, that the Afghan population was grateful to the Soviet soldiers. And there were endless interviews that started to emerge with the Afghans that were talking about life under about how the Afghan people were happy to and welcomed the Soviet soldiers. In 2015, Putin meeting Afghan veterans was starting to talk about the fact that we need to fight against extremist organizations that were fueled by the West. We continue to do that the same way as we did in Afghanistan. Later, this war started to be mentioned in the context of the Syrian war. And we can see that the rhetoric is very similar. Some slogans from the Soviet newspapers were now applied to military in newspapers in the 2010s. At the same time, Franz Klintsevich, the head of the largest Russian Union of Afghanistan veterans, launched a massive campaign to rehabilitate this war. He argued that the Soviet invasion stopped drug trafficking and international terrorism, and that the Soviet Union was the first one to take the blow of jihad, nurtured by the intelligence services of the Western countries and primarily the United States. The head of the Union proposed to revise the 1989 resolution of the Congress, the People's Deputies of the USSR, which condemned the war as a politically motivated and unjustified. It's talking about that the end of 2018, his proposal was officially approved by the State Duma. And then it was supposed to be passed as a law. It wasn't ratified. But, well, perhaps it was just a matter of time, or perhaps it was something that wasn't a political decision. By the end of 2010s, the state media had finally returned to a war-glorifying Soviet narrative. And that was happening at the level of politics. And we can see that it had a significant impact on the public opinions. The Levada Center confirms this. Over the past 25 years, the number of respondents who consider this war to be a state crime has decreased from 69 to 44%, so 1.5 times, and the number of people justifying it had grown significantly. At the same time, the attitude to Afghan veterans has changed. At the beginning of the 20s, they started to be included into the pantheon of real veterans, previously just the veterans of the Second World War. They were given the legal veteran status, and there were other political initiatives that included them. For instance, in 2004, on the Poklane Gora, where previously they only had memorials to the great Patriotic War, a monument to the internationalist soldiers was established. The same author who made the largest monument and then in 2005, the Committee of Veterans of the Great Patriotic War handed over to the Afghans a symbolic banner of victory as a symbol of them being the successes. Franz Kilskevich declared that the Afghans have finally got the well-deserved recognition. I suppose that there is a well-established state discourse. So there's a hierarchy, the veterans of the Great Patriotic War, the most honorable one, and followed by other participants of military conflicts. When the states realized that there are not many veterans of the Great Patriotic War left, and you can't get them out to visit schools, they started to engage veterans from Afghanistan. And as one of the ex-Afghan warriors said, well, we will be superseded by the Chechen veterans. Since the mid-2000s, the state also began to present two military campaigns in Chechnya as part of the global fight against international terrorism. And the soldiers were also declared heroes at the 2000s. Those that died in the initial war collisions in Chechnya, there was a huge festival to commemorate the deaths, and we realized that there were 65 monuments to those that perished. We have to say that alongside this discourse coming about, the level of support from veteran organizations began to grow. The state started to engage veteran unions to create a new patriotic narrative and an image of heroic Soviet struggle against international terrorism. And the goals of the military unions coincided with the goals of the state. Both of them tried to restore respect for the military and create a heroic image of a war, the soldiers of which were fulfilling their military duties. For example, Franz Klintsevich, that we've mentioned, compared the war in Afghanistan with the war in South Ossetia and then the war in Syria later. These campaigns were caused by the threats from the global West, trying to weaken the Soviet Union. The movement of veterans in Afghanistan began as a grassroots movement. There were various small organizations with people trying to support ex-soldiers, to get social benefits from the state, to get financing for the families of the deceased, or perhaps some financing to create monuments. But gradually, these small units were closed and they were replaced by the bigger ones. And the Combat Brotherhood, which is headed by the ex-mayor of the Moscow region, Gromov, and gradually they become fully state-funded, following state ideology, fulfilling state orders. Since 2007, the majority of regional veterans organization was supported the electoral campaigns. And once the All Russian People's Front emerged, these became the first to be supported by the deputies. In 2011, the Coward Brotherhood, the main goals of which was to create a system of participation and protecting the national interest of the state. They started to promote patriotism and unification around a national idea. Starting from 2005, the Union began to expand their field of activities and moved to preparing young people to defend the fatherland. This transition from a discourse of grief to a discourse of fame was firmly established by early 2010s when the status of all of the main unions were amended, and the main goal was now to not protect the interests of the veterans first and foremost, but to protect the national interests of Russia. This became the key obligation. Systematically ignoring this task would lead to veterans being excluded from the Union. So if veterans refuse to go to schools and to participate in this patriotic education of the youth, could be expelled. And they could be, the benefits could be withdrawn. And they might be denied support. So in a little more than 10 years, these organizations, from protecting the rights of its members, they became a fully fledged political institutions affiliated with the state. They became organizations that generate uniform communicative norms to tell a state story of the war. I wanted to talk about the tasks that the members of these military unions are now charged with. There are three key tasks. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. First and foremost, the unions created this patriotic infrastructure. On an annual basis, these organizations organize up to 3,000 military patriotic events and activities aimed at supporting the external and internal policies of the president to combat destructive opposition. And this is quoting the charters. In 2015, they coordinated 10 large-scale public activities. For instance, to mark the first anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, and every third member of the union out of 100,000 people took active part in these socio-political activities. Since the early 2000s, veterans have been actively engaged in this military patriotic education of school children, promoting army propaganda. A few examples that I randomly selected just looking at the recent news. For instance, they have a masterclass on putting together the Kalashnikov weapon in a hospital for kids, or the border agents at Khabarovsk, the healthy eating festival in Tver, and helping young criminals to practice services. My favorite, going down the Don River in Khakassia, where religious officials and the military people went down the river with the icon of the Holy Godmother to revive the spiritual traditions and to participate in the patriotic education of the youth. There are many examples of such activities. There are a lot of the schools are engaged in this initiatives, and the veterans of Afghanistan would complain that they're surrounded by schools and they only have 5 people that have to go around the schools, so make the rounds, go. It's like a new job for them every 9th of May, the Victory Day, or the anniversaries of the beginning and the end of the war. So whenever they're invited, they have to go to school. It's an obligation, and they have been complaining that it's an extra workload for them. Aside that, I suspect that these play another function. They will unite the veterans around the state. They are now under the control of the state. This is a sort of a psychological rehab for the veterans, which does not exist formally in Russia. The second role that I would want to talk about is directly related to war. With the start of the military campaigns in Donbass, veteran organizations turned into informal recruitment centers for volunteers. For instance, respondents from Yekaterinburg said that the Sverdlovsk Regional Public Fund for the Disabled and Special Forces and a number of other local organizations, starting from the beginning of the war in Donbass, would phone veterans of local wars, offering them assistance and sending them to Ukraine, helping them to get arms, helping them to get uniforms. In 2019, one of the participants of the Chechen war was talking about recruiting campaigns that hire people to be sent to Syria or to Africa. And the veterans would call these centers when they need a job, or they would ask for vacancies or openings, and this is what they would be offered. The third task of these military unions is participating in pro-government political activities after the end of the Russian-Georgian War in 2008 in Vladikavkaz, which is the city closest to the war activities. There was a huge meeting, Afghans Against the War, where the Georgian army and its actions in the South Ossetia were condemned, and they appealed collectively to the Georgian embassy with demands to stop the aggression. In 2013, after the March of Millions, which started the Bolotnaya affair, the Russian Union of Veterans held a rally at which it demanded criminal prosecution of the participants of the march. There were lots of meetings on the annexation of Crimea, organized across the entire Russia, from the biggest cities to the smallest ones, like Novomoskovsk in the Tula region, or Kstov in the Nizhny Novgorod. All of this led me to believe that these movements have turned into like contractors performing ideological orders of the state. And the last point that I wanted to focus on is how the veterans themselves reacted to the changes in the public discourse and how they took to the new role and the new tasks. From the interviews with the veterans, I gathered that the support for the new discourse was partially a response, a reaction to the negative attitudes towards them in the 1990s. Veterans internalized the Soviet state rhetoric about heroes who have fulfilled their international duty, and after returning from the war, they expected to receive the same level of respect when the society refused to treat them as heroes, and the state did not fulfill its obligation towards them. They really held a grudge, and then they welcomed this change in the rhetoric. This public condemnation, which made them feel like they were exiled, now turned around, and they started to feel this positive attitude of the state, which they welcomed. Even after they came back from the war, it's not their service that has the key plays the key role. It's their loyalty to the state. There is another important detail. All of the respondents that I talked to not only talk about the Afghanistan and the Chechen wars, they continue the rhetoric further to Donbass and Syria, speaking about them as episodes of the same endless struggle, both in the official speeches and in methodological instructions. This rhetoric of a never-ending war has become very noticeable over the last few years. When I was talking to one of the veterans from Afghanistan, who regularly participates in these educational campaigns at schools, I asked him, how do you explain, what do you talk to the skilled kids about? And he started to think about it, and what he said was, well, I come and I tell them, well, I've been to the war and you still will participate in your war. It's something that's in store for you in the future. So, well, thank you for your attention. Tatiana, Elena, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. Let's see if we have any questions from our participants or from our YouTube. Hans Ulrich. please.
Hey, just a brief question that was very, very interesting. I couldn't make anything out of your title. And all of a sudden, I heard about a phenomenon that I've never seen. Now, I mean, I'm living in a country, I'm a citizen of a country that has an even larger military than Russia, the United States of America. And of course, you see from time to time veterans in the streets. But I mean, it would be, I think, completely unthinkable, at least in California, that any of those veterans would ever talk at a high school. Hence my question. Do you think that in the first place, this is a kind of uniquely Russian type of institution? Yeah, I mean, veterans, of course, exist. I mean, whoever has been in a war professionally, and even non-professionally, comes back as a veteran. But I mean, these communities of veterans. I have an older son who was a lieutenant colonel in the German Air Force, and he once went to Russia for a visit with those veterans, and he was completely flabbergasted. He didn't dislike it, but he said he'd never seen something like that. So that is the first question. Is this a uniquely, and I say deliberately, Russian type of institution? And then secondly, clearly, I mean, given the great Patriotic War, and I say that without irony, being born in Germany, veterans had an important status in the Soviet Union. But do you think that there are significant changes, structurally speaking, functionally speaking, between the status of veterans in the Soviet Union and between the status of veterans in present-day Russia?
Elena, thank you so much. Very interesting questions. I tried to find some literature on other countries and try to compare the situation in Russia with situations across other countries. But as far as I gathered, everywhere from the US to Zimbabwe, wherever there were military conflicts, the situation is completely reversed. Veterans that come back to their countries, they are in opposition to the state, and they would form various groups like political parties, or there was a recent book that was published on how Vietnam veterans, they came back to the US, founded one of the Ku Klux Klan sections and some political movements that were opposed. In Russia, veterans turned out to be a tool to the state, which I think is not typical. It's unique. I haven't seen that anywhere else. When we talk about honoring the veterans, that's something that we can see elsewhere, but nothing of the kind. Perhaps I don't have the full picture, but from what I was able to read, I haven't seen this elsewhere. This phenomenon seems unique. In terms of the veteran status, I think it changed, of course. On the one hand, the veterans were granted this status much later than the end of the war. As we know, the first years after they came back, they were not honored. They were not recognized as war heroes and veterans. And it's curious how the initial military unions would be formed during the Soviet times. The first veteran unions for World War II were established in the West, and they needed to find Soviet veterans that would participate in international unions. And a single union was formed in order specifically for these veterans to make public speeches abroad, not in the Soviet Union. And veterans were given the right to unite, but this union was with no members. Nobody could be a permanent member of the veteran union. And they're very interesting archive notes from the first meetings. They were asking, can we gather again? Can we bring our friends? They were told, no, guys, you go abroad, you make the speech, come back, and no further actions required. And they wanted more activities. And as soon as they were able to, they started to unite. They started to organize their own initiatives and establish their own monuments. But the status that they were in now, it took them, they were only able to get it in the modern Russia. Previously, they were like playing this decorative function, decorative purposes that were used. But in the current format, I think this is something that's came about recently in the last few years. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, thank you. That's perfect and makes it even more interesting. Thank you.
Elena, we have questions from our YouTube viewers. So do you see any differences between the memories of the veterans in Afghanistan and in Chechnya? Elena, yes, of course, and there are significant differences. The discourse of the Afghan war started to emerge earlier, and the key difference here in this wars is that the Chechen war never had the status of the war. One of the wars was a political operation, the Second Chechen War, and the First Chechen War was called something or other, but it wasn't a war. The war was not mentioned in the official terminology. So soldiers that participated in these wars, they did not have the status of the veterans. They had no social benefits, and Afghan veterans were not really veterans. They had a different status, how they were treated differently. And there was some tension among the veterans. The Chechen war veterans said that they're looking up to the Afghan heroes, whereby for the Afghans, the Chechen soldiers are too young, they haven't been to war for long enough, and they treat them somehow with a lot of, they're condescending towards them in a way. And the status is also different. Seems like the war in Afghanistan was a real war, and the Chechen war is not really accepted as a full-fledged war. The discourse is not fully established, but it's evolving. And going forward, this will become more formalized. It's interesting how this attitude to the Chechen war as a heroic war is coming about. This is not something that we saw before, and it's gaining momentum. And this entire memories of the Second Chechen War and the First Chechen War is built around the memories of the 6th Troop and those that perished in the initial stages of the war. When they talk about the Chechen War, they mostly talk about the soldiers that died in Chechnya. And in this sense, these are not like generic victims. These are perished heroes that we will keep in our memories forever. So this is like this tragical aspect to it. And in this sense, the Afghan and the Chechen wars are somewhat similar. Irina, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. Don't you think that the issues of the Chechen war, because it's a war within the country, there's some duality to it. It's a bit ambiguous. With the Afghan war, you can argue whether we should have entered Afghanistan or not, but it's still a different country. And the drama of the Chechen war is in the fact that there is some kind of schizophrenic split in the state. On the one hand, Chechnya is not considered to be a part of Russia. Practically, we sense that the way the discourse is organized. On the other hand, you can't say that we were fighting against Chechnya because it's an internal conflict. So I think that the drama of the veterans of the Second World War is that the status is very ambiguous. Elena, that's a really pertinent question and a very accurate way of looking at it. You'll be surprised, but the Chechen War is not an internal war officially. It's a war with international terrorism, and it's one of the first wars followed by the wars against Islamic organizations and ISIS, and the Chechen War was the first in this whole series of anti-terrorist wars. The rhetoric evolves around the fact that the Islam terrorists emerged from somewhere and we fought them. There's no mention that this is part of our own country. And I was absolutely astounded by these events to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the death of the 6th Troop, because where they died, close to in Chechnya, there were federal officials that made speeches, and Ramzan Kadyrov made a speech, and he was talking about the heroes that perished. And I checked, and it turned out that Kadyrov, together with his father, switched. He flipped. He switched to the Russian official side 6 months before they died, and he was the one making the speech about terrorists that came out of nowhere that killed the Russian citizens. And it's nowhere mentioned that we were fighting against our own. This is something that's mentioned only in reports from Levada Center on the increase in nationalism within Russia, this lack of tolerance towards Chechens and Islam. After the Chechen War, this lack of tolerance towards Islam representatives, there was a huge spike. There was a lot of attacks on the Chechens. not soldiers that fought in Chechnya, but ethnically Chechens. So clearly it was an internal conflict, and it was a very acute conflict, but this is not something that's part of the official rhetoric. They switched our attention from this perception of a civil war to fighting against some mythical Islam terrorists. Tatiana, Yelena, we have a question from Carola. Carola, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk on a very important topic, I find. And maybe just as a first reaction, the first reaction is maybe an anecdotic reaction, because looking from Germany, it's somehow, for Germans, in a way, it was lucky that 45 war ended for quite some time. And it was interesting for me to come to the United States, or to come to Russia on the one hand in the 19s and early 1990s, in 91, 92, and for the first time see veterans begging in the streets in St. Petersburg, a phenomenon I just hadn't known. And on the other hand, coming to the United States in 2006 and having celebrations there, such as Veterans Day, and seeing the memorials for World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and the veterans gathering there on Veterans Day, and kind of recognizing for both societies that war had been continuous really after 45 also, which wasn't something really, which wasn't the experience in Germany. And then this changed again with Bosnia. And Bosnia was really the first war again to produce veterans, and German society still has trouble dealing with this in a way. There is not, so institutions, everything had to be recreated, and now kind of there are veterans again from Bosnia, from Afghanistan wars, from Iraq wars, but this was really a phenomenon of the 2000s again. So it's interesting to compare these perspectives, but this is just kind of the anecdotic. I just wanted to share. My real question is that I remember, and I'm sorry, I'm very bad with titles right now, but I remember that from the 1990s, there was a very realistic, critical literature, and also from the 1980s, really, literature and films on the war of Afghanistan and also the Chechnya war. And I was in Russia, and I was extremely impressed by that. I read some of these books. I don't remember titles anymore. I'm sorry. Something with Red Sun and films which had taken up 19th century text, but put it on Chechnya pictures. I remember dimly. Very impressive. And I wonder. And that's my first question. What happened to this literature and film and cultural representations? Are they still present in any way, or have they basically, are they out of the reception right now? That's my first question. The second question I would be interested in is in how, for just 19th century campaigns in the Caucasus are still remembered, come into this remembrance. Are they present in any way? Figures like Shamil and the Russian campaign in the mid-19th centuries, are they present in any way, or is that something which are two different stories, basically? Thank you so much.
Elena, thank you so much for your questions. They're incredibly interesting. You mentioned the film from 1991, Nikita Tsaga, an amazing film. In fact, I don't remember which novel from the 19th century it was based on, about somebody who loses his leg in Chechnya, and then he thinks that this leg performs crimes instead of him. It became unnoticed. Unfortunately, it's great that you remember it, but not many remember it here. And I asked a lot of veterans from Afghan and from Chechnya whether they remember any books or films about the war. Is there anything that they consider truthful and important? But as a rule, they all said that no, and nobody understands our experience. All of these facade parade films with a lot of shooting and huge budgets, they know it's not about them. But films like The Leg, I guess they are too gloomy, too traumatic, and they try to disassociate from that as well. The one film that they mentioned is one film from the 90s, the Afghan war. I think it also distorted the war a little bit, in my opinion, but they stood by it and they thought it was a bit realistic, truthful in representing the war. I think there was a lot of films that went unnoticed, they were forgotten. And then after a while, these new parades, so to say, official films started to emerge. Well, they don't really resonate with the veterans or the society, in fact. There is a sort of lacuna in social consciousness. Sometimes it's a scandal when a new film comes out. There was a recent film that caused a huge scandal because the Afghan veterans said that it wasn't about them, that it has nothing to do with the experience, and that it's a very dark way of representing the war. But there is no single film that would be a cultural phenomenon and that would resonate with the veterans. I don't think that exists. Unfortunately, it is in fact a gap in the cultural context that's not filled yet. Now, talking about Caucasus campaigns of the mid-19th century, they're not part of the discourse. I haven't thought about it before, but I think the reason is that we can't remember Shamil because we can't consider the Chechen wars as a continuation of a struggle against Shamil, because, well, we're talking about not fighting our own citizens, we're talking about international terrorism, and Shamil has nothing to do with that. If we continue to fight against the Caucasus representatives that we've been fighting against for many centuries, why haven't we won yet? Where is the victory? Why are we killing our own citizens? So these campaigns don't fit in, or it's something like mythic, like well, the Vladimir campaigns from way back. And essentially nothing except the Second World War was part of this official discourse. That was the ice battle. And then there was this huge founding concept of the Great Patriotic War and everything that follows after. The Caucasus Wars are not part of this cultural perception. They're not part of this pyramid constructed, and it shouldn't be. Irina, in terms of the books, like the Tink Boys by Svetlana Alexievich, this book is still well known. It's not part of the official discourse, of course, but because Alexievich has this Boys in Tink, this book keeps being republished. This anthropology of war, penned by Alexander Exilevich, is there, although it's not the mainstream narrative. Boys in Zinc, yes, that's a perfect example. And there were other authors as well that wrote about the war. But I have this feeling that they're not really in demand by the state. You can't build a mythology based on Alexievich's text. It's impossible. And the veterans themselves wouldn't read these books. A curious and strange response I got when I asked about Alexievich, they kept saying that, well, several people said the same thing. I haven't read Alexievich, but I know that she talks bad about Russia. She represents it in an unfavorable light. So everybody has this perception. And after she got the Nobel Prize, people made these conclusions and they never opened the book, but they have their opinions. And they were talking about Shalamov, talking about the reality, and Alexievich was similar. Even that is typical. It's typical. This is something that people do respond to in the same way. Perhaps I missed this, but It's interesting that this whole perception of the Afghan history started with the Union of Soldiers' Mothers, this organization that came about at the end of the 80s. The mothers of the soldiers that died in Afghanistan created the social organization, and the goal was to cherish the memories of those that died and against the crime of the war that killed their sons. And they played one of the key roles in the revolution of 1991. In August, they were all there on the barricades, and for a long time, they were a force to be reckoned with. And then after, well, they seem to continue to exist, but they're not a real organization anymore, even because they were really oppressed and the leadership was overtaken. And it all started as women against war, the movement. And this is what Elena was talking about. And we get into this typical Soviet indoctrination. I remember when I was at school, we had veterans come to us, and now I suspect that these were probably suspicious, smearish people, like not really veterans. They kept talking about endlessly about the great Patriotic War. So all of the tools of the Soviet propaganda is now adopted by the current situation, the current state. Elena, thank you. It's very interesting that you mentioned these female organizations, not even mothers, but wives as well. In one of the cities, I found a union of the wives of the soldiers that died in Afghanistan. I tried to reach out to them, and I talked to the deputy of the local Duma, who was part of the military union. She gave me a phone number of this lady, and she said, well, yes, the widows of the soldiers that died, they gather in our office. We give them some support to organize some, well, not celebrations, but gatherings. And she was very frightened, this lady. She refused to talk to me. I told her that, well, I was calling from the local deputy. Then she called the deputy. She confirmed my identity. She confirmed that I was who I was saying I was. And she agreed to talk to me. And then she was very open. She really told me that she was grateful to the local deputy for his help to their organization. And I was like horrified because, well, these Afghan mothers and wives they don't seem to be aware of what was actually underlying all of these movements. There's another interesting story that has to do with the role of the wives and the mothers of the Chechen soldiers, as far as I know. The basis of the discourse for the first Chechen war is based on this movement of soldiers' mothers. So if you look at all the newspapers from the first Chechen war, the basis of this discourse are the boys that died with guns in their hands and these innocent young soldiers. And that came from the mothers going to Chechnya. They were talking, this was all heavily covered, and the memories of the first Chechen war is the memory of these young kids that died, this new recruits. I don't remember, one of the deputies back in the day called them this green recruits. And this is the memory that stayed. And even the current state discourse cannot appropriate this. And it seems like that there's a global war in Chechnya with the sixth troop, but the first war is somewhere there on the periphery with this very tragic narrative about the young soldiers that died and their mothers that were mourning them in Chechnya. And there's nothing you can do from that to transform it into a state ideology. And this movement of the Chechen mothers sort of stands apart still. And it still has an impact on the memory of the war, and there is nothing that you can do to overturn that. There was nothing similar with the second Chechen war. There was a very rigid censorship, and there were no mothers going to Chechnya. It was mostly not conscription army, it was professionals. So, Tatiana, we have lots more questions for you, Elena, but, well, we are out of time a little bit. So thank you so much for the discussion.